I tell my students that if I had easy answers to these questions, we'd just go home and we wouldn't have to talk about anything else and game over. But we have a lot to talk about. Facebook's facial recognition algorithm does exceed most human beings' capabilities when it comes to recognizing faces. So if you make these devices like social robots that come into our homes and we have social relationships with, what is their status? Who's liable for what happens when a bad decision is made or a bad outcome occurs? Because with a DAO, there's nothing to punish. When we talk about moving AI from theory to practice, I think we're looking at a number of issues and concerns. One of those is expectation versus realistic performance. I think the expectation from the 50s when the term artificial intelligence was first described and coined was that we would have human-grade intelligence. In fact, John McCarthy, who came up with the term artificial intelligence, pretty much pitched it as we were going to teach machines to think like a human. Well, it's clear that isn't going to happen anytime soon. It may never happen. But what we do have are really good devices that can do amazing things that even exceed our capabilities. For example, Facebook's facial recognition algorithm does exceed most human beings' capabilities when it comes to recognizing faces. Or the AlphaZero algorithm at DeepMind. It can play any board game better than any human player. But that's all they can do, right? So we have not this artificial general intelligence that we were dreaming of, but we have these sort of idiot savants that are really good at very specific kinds of things. And I think as we move from theory to practice, what we're seeing is this proliferation of really specific uses of AI technology to get a job done. But the goal of a kind of general intelligence like we were dreaming about in the 50s, I think that's still a dream. When we talk about this sort of ethical questions, there's really two components. One is on the side of the AI as an agent, as an actor, and the other is on the side of the AI as a patient or a receiver of certain sorts of actions. So most of the work in AI ethics has been on the side of responsibility and on action. And the question is whether or not we can always tie liability and accountability to a human being when you have machines that are enabling independent decision making. Especially with machine learning and connectionist architectures, you have machines now that aren't explicitly programmed step by step to do something, but rather learn what to do from cycling through large data sets to find patterns and then developing their behaviors based on what they discover. When that happens, we have some difficulties when it comes to assigning responsibility. A really good example is AlphaGo, which was the initial algorithm at DeepMind that was able to beat Lee Sedol in the game of Go. When the algorithm beat this Korean champion in the game of Go, the journalist asked the engineers, okay, so what did you guys do to make this such a good Go player? And the engineer said, we don't know. We don't know why it did what it did. In fact, there was one move in the second game, I think it was move 38, where AlphaGo did something that to the observers looked to be like a really stupid move. Like so out of the ordinary that no human player would ever make this move. Well, it turned out to be the genius move that took the game. And the engineers could not anticipate this. Now that's a good example, right? It's a game. But what happens when that algorithm is in the self-driving car and the car learns certain behaviors and does things that are unexpected by the engineers who built the system? Then I think we have questions having to do with responsibility that aren't necessarily tied to a direct human programmer anymore, and we have to start looking at the AI as a responsible agent. On the flip side, the other question is, okay, so if you make these devices like social robots that come into our homes and we have social relationships with, what is their status? They're not quite a thing, they're not quite a person, there's some other object that's in between thing and person. We don't have a lot of examples of artifacts in our world that have that status. We have some natural things that have that kind of in-between status, like a dog, right? The family dog is not quite a member of the family, but is not quite another object that you can dispose of. And I think the robots that we're developing and the digital assistants and everything else that we're familiar with are pushing on those boundaries, asking us to describe a social status that's a little different from what we're used to with either things or with human beings. And I think eventually that impinges on legal questions, like do you recognize a robot as a person for the purposes of making it subject to law? And you can see how this eventually gets to be some pretty large questions, especially when you start to look at it on a global scale. What Malta is doing is, I think, really innovative. They're trying to carve out a space for themselves in the AI domain. Because they're not a leading innovator in technology, they've decided that the way to carve out that space is on the regulation side. And so they are experimenting with a number of different initiatives to come up with really different ways of thinking about AI as a legal entity and how it is that we will legislate for it. The proposal that is before the legislature right now has to do with what are called decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs. They're not quite AIs, but they're a kind of related technology. And the idea is, how can we scale corporate law, especially international corporate law, to meet the challenges and the opportunities that the DAO provides with regards to its status as a corporate entity. And so one of the things they've done is they've recognized the legal identity of the DAO as a digital identity, and that's part of the law. There's also, working into this, a way to try to decide who's liable for what happens when a bad decision is made or a bad outcome occurs. Because with a DAO, there's nothing to punish, right? There is no body to imprison, as one famous AI scientist once said. So if there is liability, and the liability belongs to the DAO, who then is to be the target for any retribution if that is necessary as a legal thing. So there's still a lot to be worked out, but I think what's really interesting and innovative on their part is they're really at the forefront of thinking about these new legal and regulatory challenges, and actually not just thinking about it, but actually trying to do something and say, what if we draft this legislation? What does it open up? What new opportunities does it provide? What new challenges does it provide? And I think that's the thing that they really should be commended for in terms of their thinking on this matter. So it's rare when you get in one place at one time all the major players that have a voice in this debate, right? So we have at the summit people from the industry, we have people from academia, we have people from the legal realm, we have people from the financial industry. All of these folks are involved and they have skin in the game. And so we need to have them talking to each other. Otherwise, you're going to have one group of people developing solutions that are unique to their little core discipline or their little core pet projects that don't necessarily address the wider issues. And I think when we have opportunities to bring folks into one location and have a wider conversation, obviously you're not going to resolve a lot in 2 days, but you're going to open lines of communication. And I think that's absolutely crucial.